For more than 2 decades, she's made a solid impact on the disabled sports world. Welcome, Cheri Blauwet. Cheri, it's been a long time, but you're so involved in so many different things. When I look at your body of work, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, and it makes me feel a little bit lazy. How do you keep going?
It's a good question. Yeah, I've always, Bob, honestly, obviously, I had my competitive career as an athlete, which was just, an incredible journey. And even through that time, I always knew that although I can't compete forever, I was super passionate about Paralympic sport and adaptive sport. And so I was already scheming ways to keep it part of my life. And so, when I was competing, I was a medical student through much of that time. And then when I stopped competing internationally after Beijing, that's right when I started my medical residency. And I was through that whole time just looking for ways to stay involved and feel fortunate to have been able to craft a career in medicine now that really focuses on sports medicine, but with this niche in Paralympic sport and working with athletes with disabilities on things like injury prevention and some of the research around that. And then translating that to, being involved in the movement through the IPC and the IOC and other avenues. So really, it's just that passion translated to a different phase.
Cheri, and thanks for that, because I want to jump right into, the medical aspect and your involvement with, the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee. With your medical background, you become somewhat integrally involved, and you even chair the medical committee for the Paralympics. So maybe you could share some insights. As we were going through the Paralympic Games, there was so much chatter on social media about, oh, look at Brent Lakatos. He's being pushed out because he's a 53, and the quads are yelling and screaming. They did away with the 51s and the 52s, and now there's all this amputee running. First of all, have we gotten to the point where the A standard has become so difficult to attain that maybe it's gotten too difficult? Are we pushing people out by virtue of becoming so good?
Oh, wow. Good question. Well, I think, I could give one opinion on that, but the reason that question is difficult, I think, Bob, is because different people around the world have different visions of what the Paralympic movement should be sometimes, right? And so there's a whole lot of people from a whole lot of countries who feel like the ultimate guiding principle of the Paralympic movement should be inclusion, and thinking about how we develop opportunities on the sport program so that people with even more significant disabilities are able to compete at that elite level and push themselves to the limit of their capabilities, right? And what their bodies can do. And that's a little bit of a different guiding principle than, having a whole bunch of races for one class that we know is highly competitive, where you may have some of the same athletes being able to do 4 or 5 events, screaming around the track, absolutely stellar and jaw-dropping performances, but then having fewer opportunities, for an athlete with quadriparetic cerebral palsy. And frankly, I'm not going to answer your question on this interview to say which is the better principle. I just think it's an ongoing debate within the movement, and a really healthy debate within the movement, to think about how we direct it. And I do think that we in the U.S. have to understand that it is a global movement, and that people from other parts of the world sometimes bring a different ethos to the movement. And so,
Well, undoubtedly, Cheri, and when people toss around the word inclusion, so loosely sometimes, but it kind of comes with a lot of duality of meaning. And I understand and appreciate where you're coming from, because there is no simple answer, is there?
No. And to me, I mean, my personal take, I think inclusion does mean, I think every athletes with a disability, regardless of your disability type, should have the opportunity somewhere to compete at an elite level, if that is their goal and their drive and they're talented at it, right? So, I'm not going to say that I think, having one more event for a wheelchair racer is more important than having an elite event for a quadriparetic CP bocce player, because that quadriparetic CP bocce player also has the right to compete, right? And then, whether it should be at the Paralympic Games or not, that's another question. But I think that ultimately, disability rights and inclusion should uphold that all athletes with disabilities have a right to compete on the world stage via an avenue, right? And so, yeah, and so that's why I think there's a rub there, because some of those events are easier for the public to understand. Some are more difficult for the public to understand. Some are very fast paced. Some aren't. Some are more precision based, and it challenges us to, if we're thinking about optimizing inclusion in elite sport for people with disabilities, then we have to find a way to translate that concept to the public so that they understand why some of these other events are elite, right? And why what those athletes are doing is at the limit of human performance for them.
Cheri, and I do understand and appreciate that. I can recall all the way back to the 96 games in Atlanta when we first started to see amputee running. And, frankly, it wasn't all that stunning really to watch. I mean, very archaic, artificial limbs and none of the really cool carbon fiber stuff that we're seeing today. So we went from 96 to 2000. It got a little bit cooler with Brian Fraser and Marlon Shirley. And then all of a sudden it really started to take off. Now we have a sport where we're seeing 400-meter guys running 53 seconds. We're seeing 100-meter guys running 11 seconds. So maybe there is room for more sport.
Right, right. And the other I think big point within that is the women's side of sport. So many of our events are well developed on the men's side, but not yet on the women's side. And it's a call to action to the community to say that we need to do more around development for women with disabilities in sport, so that those competitive opportunities, there are just as many events on the program, and we're not taking events off the program simply because there's not enough athletes to compete in the event. To me, that's crazy. Of course of course there are enough women with disabilities around the world who can be developed for these events, but it's not happening. And that to me is really frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. And in many ways, what I witnessed on the track, I did fast forward through a lot of things. We all have our particular esoteric niche, and I watched the racing, and frankly, the women's racing was a lot more dicey and a lot more interesting. We're starting to see a rise in basketball. The women's basketball has turned very interesting once again. So yeah, I mean the women of our sports world have definitely started to emerge in a very positive way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, and Bob, a lot of the work that I do now with IPC is really, it's actually less so focused on. I love what I do. It's less so focused on things like classification and fairness. It's more focused on athlete health, and that's a really exciting opportunity to think about athletes with varied types of disabilities coming from places where medical resources are also highly variable, and then coming to this world stage. And, what do we need to do in terms of policy and practice and athlete education to ensure that, they're coming onto the field of play healthy and ready to perform, and then, leave their athletic career healthy and bringing that legacy of health through sport with them, not, having experienced a lot of detrimental health outcomes of competing. And so, that's been a really interesting and dynamic area that's growing by leaps and bounds internationally. A lot more, clinicians and researchers becoming interested in the Paralympic athlete. And it's been awesome to watch that evolve. Now, for example, if there's a major, position statement or consensus paper that's written in the sports medicine literature about a certain topic, it's actually now becoming far less acceptable for you to leave Paralympic sport considerations out of that paper, or to not, write another paper in parallel to talk about the para athlete. From a inclusion standpoint, that's now expected, right? That you also think about our athlete population, and that's definitely been an evolution that wasn't happening 20 years ago, or really even 10 years ago. And it's been really, really cool to be a part of that and to watch that evolve.
Hey, a couple of weeks ago, I caught up with Hunter Woodall, who is an amputee sprinter and actually 400 meter. And he made an interesting statement. I asked him, we were talking about some of the athletes who had pushed and strived to get into the Olympics. And he said, frankly, I'm pretty happy, content, and, even feeling deserving of just being a Paralympian is enough for me. And I thought that was a really interesting statement, coming from somebody who had come from a very high profile place, that he was content with the concept that being a Paralympian carried enough honor with it.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, Bob. And I think part of that, I wonder, it'd be interesting to ask him what he would have felt had he come into the prime of his career 10 years ago. Would he have felt the same? Because I think part of that sentiment, and I don't want to put words in his mouth by any means, but I do think that our athletes now, especially our high-profile Paralympians like Hunter, have a much different experience than in the past because of the way in which they can use social media to elevate their public profile, for example, the way in which, corporate sponsors are paying a lot more attention to Paralympic sport than ever before. And that is enabling athletes to really develop the profile that they want to develop through Paralympics, rather than feeling like they have to also look for a side gig or a parallel gig in the Olympic Games in order to achieve that notoriety, right? And the things that come with that notoriety. So I bet it, again, not putting words in his mouth, I bet he would have felt differently when you and I were competing, right? And because it was really difficult then. And people didn't know what the Paralympics was. It's still a problem across our country, but it's getting a lot better. And kudos also to athletes like Hunter, who are using the platforms and elevating their profile with those platforms to bring so much more awareness to Paralympic
Well,
sport.
and even more so at our point in time, we were looking at the exhibition 15 at 8, and they finally got pushed out of the Olympics. But I think in many ways it did kind of help to make our point in terms of what we were trying to push, which was that we fought, the old battle, the old cliche, I'm not an inspiration, I'm an athlete. So I think even though it did get pushed from the Olympics, it still kind of did its job.
Yeah, in a way. And interesting that I competed in the last one when we did the exhibition event in Athens in 2004. 800 meters for women and 1500 meters for men. And having been there, I can see why it happened, right? Because it was a really challenging time. Obviously, myself and fellow athletes were coming from different countries, coming into the Olympic Village to do this exhibition event, in the stadium. But there was a lot of discontent and even hard feelings around it, because although everyone was really happy to compete, the Paralympic athletes were getting really disparate treatments. Some of their national Olympic committees were really embracing them, welcoming them into the village, giving them the full kit, helping them to be part of the team. Others just weren't. And the athletes were getting really emotionally and psychologically negatively impacted by having to go into this very hostile environment where their Olympic committee wasn't supporting them at all, and getting really second class citizen treatment. And I think because of that, that was part of why the IPC said, forget it. Like, if you're not going to treat our athletes well, then we're going to host a really phenomenal Paralympic Games and give them the best experience possible. And at least that's within our control.
And that has happened.
Yeah. And in many ways, that was a strong statement. And I think probably the right statement at the time, although, certainly it was phenomenal to be there on the track at the Olympic Games.
Well, I really thank you for your involvement. Cheri, you've been named one of Boston's 10 outstanding young leaders, and you've always done the utmost to represent our community with the highest standards. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Really, really great insights.
Thank you, Bob. This is really fun. And hi to everybody out there. It's just been a pleasure, and so proud of our community and how it's grown over these years. So thanks very much.
Catch up soon.
Yep, you too.